Welcome, everybody, and welcome, Tom. I want to say, before I even tell you about Tom, I would like to say a very special thank you to him. He's actually on sabbatical, so pulling him in, even on Zoom in this moment, is a big ask. So thank you, Tom. It's really a huge pleasure to introduce Tom. He is our CRP colleague. And this is really one layer of the purpose of the colloquia this semester, that they offer you a chance to hear about faculty's work and their research. That's a lovely opportunity for students, but it's also actually a fantastic opportunity for faculty to have a chance to listen and to engage with each other's work. And so Tom is an urbanist and he's a historian. He has an expertise in American landscape, and he's really especially interested in infrastructure. Today he's going to talk about roads, but as a way of thinking about urbanism in 20th century New York City. Besides being a professor in CRP, he's also a historian in residence for the New York City Parks Department. And I found a very beautiful bio, which I recommend everybody read. There he says, quote, "I am a fourth generation Brooklynite and grew up with this, both city and nature close at hand." And I really think this immersion of a family history, a personal history, scholarly questions, and popular questions is what shapes his writing. He writes about this combination of thinking about the urban world and nature as, quote, "twin worlds that seeded my interest in both landscape and urbanism, nature and cities." So he started by studying forestry, then he moved to landscape architecture. He studied here at Cornell. He studied urbanism and the history of urbanism at MIT and Harvard. And Tom is a colleague who writes popular and scholarly books. So he's going to speak today from his book, Brooklyn, the Once and Future City. And he's written many other books, which I really encourage you to take a look at. And before I let him start his talk, I really want to say a little something about writing books. Books actually shape our field. Books shape popular debate. In my own thinking, if I think about what academic work has pushed me, it's actually from books in my case. And writing academic books, writing popular books, writing actually books that cross both those worlds of the university and popular interest really takes an immense amount of skill and craft and time. And it's a chance to weave a very thick story, a multidimensional story, a story that's about context, but that can also travel. So I'm saying that because I really think it's a lovely privilege for us to listen to Tom talk about this small slice of his Brooklyn work and his Brooklyn book. And for MRPs in particular, we're heading to New York City in a few weeks. So this is a little bit of an intro for that. And the title of Tom's talk is Mosaic Roads. So really, this is a chance to think Brooklyn, to think New York City, to think about infrastructure, to think about planning and its context and its politics and its material, ways in which it shapes the environment. But I'd really encourage you to listen to it, to think about New York City, but also to think about the context where you come from, the context where you're thinking and engaging in planning work, because roads and these sorts of planning processes are really fundamental, across our urban worlds. Okay, so with that very long intro, thank you so much, Tom, and we're looking forward to listening.
Thank you. Thank you, Sophie. I assume you guys can hear me here. Yes, I am on sabbatical. I'm actually at the beach. What you see behind me is just a screenshot. I'm actually kidding. I want to, so I'm going to talk about, my talk today is going to cover several aspects of the development of highways in the New York metro area, which really means that it's also about the development, the evolution of highways generally. Why? Simply because the modern high-speed, grade-separated, limited access highway, the highway we all know all too well, actually, was a New York City or a New York invention, right? And it's one, obviously, that spread very quickly throughout America, but also around the world, right? It's also an invention with a very distinct Cornell pedigree, a Cornell lineage, which, and actually, specifically a CRP lineage, right? And I'll explain that more in a moment. So my talk really has two parts to it. First, I'll talk, as I said, briefly about the origins of the modern highway, and then show how these early roads, right, and really the beginnings of the modern highway were as parkways, right, and they were literally park-ways, the original spelling. They were not only meant to immerse motorists in a kind of stage set rural landscape, right, in linear form, almost like you can almost imagine them or think of them as extruded versions of the Olmsted Park, of say Central Park or Prospect Park, but also to provide a whole range of amenities for the non-driving public, right, along the way. So these roads were not just for motorists, they were really for everybody, right? And then what I'll show is how this early, you could think of it as a humanistic infrastructure, the humanistic highway, this very fragile union of, man-machine union here, was largely lost in the post-war era, right? When speed and efficiency really come to dominate much of American society. And then in the second half of my talk, I want to focus on an extraordinary road project that was born out of the great backlash against urban expressway construction that comes out of the larger countercultural movements of the 1960s. And an extraordinary project that really sought to fuse opposing values and visions about infrastructure in the city, right? Essentially, and I'm oversimplifying a little bit here, but essentially the values and visions of a Robert Moses on one side and a Jane Jacobs on the other. So let me get started here. And I'm going to try to bounce back and forth between my images and me. Or the image of me here, so that we don't get too, so I'm going to share my screen here. I assume Sophie or Linda, let me know if for some reason you can't see this. That's and the title of my talk, Mosaic Roads, is not, I'm not here referring to a mosaic with little bits of tile and glass, but a term that refers to Moses, not the biblical Moses, but Robert Moses, who you see in a very frightening sort of apparition here. The origins of the highway, the modern highway, limited access, grade separated, high-speed road, actually are rooted in a what we would today call a stream restoration project, right? It had nothing to do with roads at the outset. And this was an effort to clean up a once beautiful stream. It's not really a river, but it's more of a stream that runs through Westchester County called the Bronx River, all right? It's a small stream, and it was horrifically polluted by the early years of the 20th century. It had basically been turned into an open sewer with effluent being discharged into it from a number of municipalities, including some quite large ones in Westchester. And also there was a lot of industry lining the banks of the river, pouring all sorts of horrific chemicals and waste into this stream. The effort was launched by a group of patrician environmentalists based here in New York, and I'm actually sitting in Morningside Heights here in Manhattan. And these were an interesting group of men, and they were all men. I'm not going to get into too much detail, but if I'll point you to the chapter in my Brooklyn book where you can read more about this. They were not the nicest bunch of men either. They were some of them horrific racists. Especially the one fellow who really spearheaded this effort to reclaim the Bronx River was a fellow named Madison Grant, who actually wrote one of the most popular racist screeds of the era called The Passing of the Great Race. And he was involved with the New York Zoological Society, as were many of these other men. The New York Zoological Society is now the World Wildlife Fund, I believe. If somebody's got Google up, maybe you can check that for me, but I'm pretty sure. And the roots of this organization are not very pleasant. Let me just put it that way. It was a very racist group of men. But in any case, they wanted to clean the Bronx River up. Why? Well, because the river was flowing into what we know today as the Bronx Zoo, the New York Zoological Society, or the New York Zoological Gardens, which was basically the playground of this group of patrician men, right? And so the water was so polluted, it was killing a lot of the animals in the, or sickening a lot of the animals. So they basically spearhead this effort to clean up the Bronx River. It wasn't a very equitable project. This is in an era before community meetings and democratic input that sought to tap the local affected populations. They just basically scraped everything off the banks of the river. They acquired through condemnation or outright purchase the banks of the river. There happened to be a lot of poor people living in ramshackle tenements and old houses along the banks of the river, mostly African Americans and poor Italian Americans who were working in various industries, some Irish residents as well. Why do we associate the Bronx River with a parkway? Well, the idea comes along later that why not, if we're going to create this linear park to save the river, why not weave a scenic road through it, right? So that all the affluent people in Westchester, including these men, could putter around in their, Packards and Duesenbergs on a Sunday afternoon, right? And that's a longer story that I won't get into, but the result is this, right? This is an early photograph of the Bronx River Parkway. And this is really the first modern highway in the world. And again, by modern highway, I mean a grade separated, limited access, high speed road set within a very ample right of way, right? To which abutting landowners have no right to, put a driveway or a curb cut into, right? And so this is built and it's very popular. It actually boosts land values all along its extent, right? And today we might think, well, why the hell would you, want to live near a highway? Well, remember, this is 1920s. These cars were tiny and quiet and slow, and this was mainly seen as a park space, right? So parks generally boost property values. So this road pretty much paid for itself by boosting assessments, property values in Westchester County. And the county goes on a parkway building binge all through the 20s and into the 1930s. Some of you may be from Westchester or New York City or have been on some of these roads. And some of these are the Hutchinson River Parkway, the Sawmill Parkway, the Cross County, right? These are all, created in this first this first era of highway construction in the United States and in the world, right? And I mentioned that there was a Cornell connection here, and specifically a CRP connection. And it's this gentleman here you see on the right. He's not a cop there. That's a photo of him when he served as in the Corps of Engineers in World War I. And this is Gilmore Clark. Some of you may know this name. He's relevant to us because Gilmore Clark was a landscape architect. He graduated from Cornell class of 1913 and received a degree in what basically landscape architecture. The degree was, the department was not known as that back in the early years of the 20th century. It was actually called the Department of Rural Art, which is a very quaint and memorable name. Clark, as I said, serves in the Army in World War II, and then afterward joins the Bronx River Parkway Authority as their lead designer, right? And he is responsible for much of the alignment and design of this early road, as well as designing all those picturesque stone-faced bridges that take roads over the Bronx Parkway itself. The reason there's a CRP connection here is that in the 1930s, the Carnegie Foundation decides to give Cornell money to create a program that was interdisciplinary and that looked at city planning, right, as a fusion of infrastructure, landscape architecture, engineering, and they tap Clark to head this up, right? So Clark is the first professor of city and regional planning at Cornell. He is effectively the founder of our department, right? He later becomes dean of the College of Architecture, as it was known then. Art and planning is not added into the name until the 1960s. And this wasn't in Sibley. This is over across the way in Whitehall, right, which is the building just next to Jayden, between McGraw and Jayden. It doesn't, the department and the school doesn't move, the college doesn't move into Sibley and also until the 1960s. And Clark not only leads the design and planning effort that gives us these parkways in Westchester, but he also comes up with this spearheads this effort to use these parkways as the kind of ligature that holds together a larger entity, and that is a region-wide, a county-wide park system, right? And you can see a beautiful watercolor rendering, a map of this larger park system. And this is really the first park system of the motor age, right? This is, and of course, this is, New York City is down here. I'm like right about down there. I don't know if you could see my cursor. And this is Westchester County. And this, these roads and this park system, this is really something new under the sun, right? And it has enormous influence, not, as I said, not only in the United States, but around the world, right? Officials, planning officials, transportation officials, engineers, planners come to Westchester to study what Clark and the Westchester County Park Commission have done, right? And from all over, cities all over the United States, but all over from around the world, including from China, Australia, New Zealand, many countries in Europe, including Germany. Many people think that the Autobahn in and around Berlin were the first modern highways in the world. It is not true. Those engineers who designed those roads in the early 30s actually came to Westchester and studied the roads and Clark had actually given them a tour to show how they designed these roads. So really, this is a cradle, one of the cradles, right? Westchester County is one of the cradles of modern motoring culture and the motor age, right? Among the individuals who really pays attention to what's going on here is Robert Moses, right? Moses actually met Clark very early on when Clark was directing the Bronx River Parkway project. I talk about how they met in my book. I won't get into it in this talk here, but they really hit it off, right? And Moses was not a designer himself, right? But he understood that it was vital to have a crack design and engineering team around him, right? In order to implement and design and implement these projects that he had in mind to, as he put it, and I'm paraphrasing, weave together the loose strands of the New York metropolitan area, right? So he looks to what Clark and company are doing in Westchester, and he basically replicates that. Where? On Long Island first, right? Some of you may be from Long Island. He heads up the Long Island State Park Commission, which is one of a number of state park commissions that are formed largely through Moses's efforts in the early 1920s. He drafts the state park plan for New York State, and I think it was 1922. And by 1924, you have the Finger Lakes State Park Commission, for example, which creates parks like Teganic Falls and Treman State Park, right? Buttermilk Falls. Those are Robert Moses initiatives, right? We think of Moses as a New York entity, New York City, and generally as a monster, because in the post-war era, Moses does become a monster. But the pre-war Moses was a great park builder, not for everyone, right? In fact, one of the classic stories that came out of Robert Caro's 1974 book, The Power Broker, which is a book that I'm sure some of you have already encountered and perhaps will in coming semesters at Cornell. You certainly will encounter it if you take my classes. But one of the stories is that he directed his engineers to build the bridges, the overpass bridges on the Southern State Parkway, low enough so that buses from New York City, presumably filled with poor people of color, could not get past them, right? So basically these were barriers to prevent poor people from getting from New York City to Jones Beach, right? Which was the original reason he built the Southern State Parkway. I always doubted this story because the sources of it are somewhat vague, but also because buses weren't allowed in the first place on these roads. The parkways were all designed from the get-go as for passenger cars only, and they still are, right? You go on any of the parkways in the New York City area, there's no commercial traffic allowed. So why would you build the bridges low when buses weren't able to get on the road in the first? Well, Moses wasn't stupid. As he put it to one of his staff, laws can always be changed. So here was a backstop to the law, a literal concrete barrier that would keep poor people from Jones Beach. I tested this theory, and the reason I'm putting this up here is I wrote a piece for City Lab a few years ago about this. What I did was I got in touch with the state DOT, and long story short, they sent me data on the clearances of all the overpasses and bridges in New York State. And I looked at the heights of these overpasses, the clearances on the Southern State Parkway, and compared them to the 3 parkways in Westchester that were operating at the time: Bronx, Sawmill, Hutchinson. And lo and behold, the Southern State clearances are significantly lower than those earlier roads. So it appears to be a true story. Anyway, when Robert Moses is put in charge of the New York City parks, right? The New York City Parks Department, and he's the first. He's appointed commissioner by Mayor LaGuardia in 1934, and he is the first commissioner of the unified the newly unified citywide Parks Department. Prior to this, each borough had its own Parks Department. And he very ingeniously configures the thrust of the Parks Department to include parkways. Why? Because, as I said earlier, people thought of these, and he certainly promoted these, as parks primarily, not roads, not arterial infrastructure. So that, gave him authority to build all these roads, because he was building a linear park, right? And this is one of them. This is the Grand Central Parkway leading out to into Queens, right? And he builds a number of parkways in New York City, right? The Grand Central, the Interborough Parkway, which was later renamed the Jackie Robinson Parkway, the Belt Parkway, the Cross Island Parkway, and others, right? And these roads are Henry Hudson, and this is the Henry Hudson Parkway, or a portion of it here. This is maybe the best example to illustrate what I said earlier, that these roads, even though they were highways, they were very different than what's going to come after World War II. These were humanistic roads. And by that, I mean, they were not just intended for the motorist, for driving, for cars, but provided a rich array of amenities for everyone else. And you can see here, and I'm sitting here not very far from Riverside Park. And you can see, here's the parkway, right? Sweeping through the corridor here. But here you see pedestrian promenades, a playground, right? This is today known as the Dinosaur Playground. There's basketball courts and soccer pitches and ponds and all sorts of amenities for the non-driving public. Here's another little playground, right? And this is the 79th Street interchange and the 79th Street boat basin, right? A lot of these what appear to be road, well, you could see there's a lot of pedestrian infrastructure here, as well as the roads. Anyway, this is probably the best example of this fusion of city and automobile, right? This is a fleeting moment of accord, of union, right, between these entities, but a significant one indeed. And here's another example. This is a photo of a part of the Belt Parkway that runs through Brooklyn and Queens around the southern edge of those boroughs. And this included what at the time was really the longest Class 1 bikeway in North America, right? 58 miles of bicycle paths were urged by Moses, and in fact, many of these miles were actually built, right? Most of the Belt Parkway has a kind of miniature bike parkway running adjacent to it, as do some other roads. And, again, this is something that is a little bit counter to the popular narrative about Moses. And I'm not trying to exonerate Moses fully here, but we tend to think of Moses as another story from Caro's Power Broker was that he failed to and refused to build a bikeway, bike lanes on the Verrazano Bridge that would have allowed people from Staten Island to commute to over the Narrows. That is a true story. It is a very egregious, omission. But we forget that he was actually the biggest builder of bikeways prior to that in the pre-war era. Post-war, everything changes, right? Moses goes from mostly a good guy, not always, but mostly doing good stuff, and into mostly doing bad stuff. You all know, or perhaps have heard the adage, power corrupts, and complete power corrupts completely. I think I might have gotten that a little bit wrong, but something like that. And so this kind of leisurely sachet through the landscape, this kind of wonderful fusion of city and infrastructure, auto infrastructure, that is all set aside for this, right? This is a portion of the Jackie Robinson Parkway in Brooklyn or Queens. And then this is a portion of the BQE, the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, where you see it's been rammed through at great cost to the communities here, at great, causing real devastation to the fabric of the city here and its people. This is in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, right? So everything changes in this period. As I said, the post-war period is all, you have this new ethos that comes to the fore, and it's one of speed, efficiency, the engineering ethic really comes to the foreground, and values of beauty and scenic qualities, right? The landscape architects really recede in importance, and the traffic engineers move to the foreground, right? And then we really have this this period when we build roads that have seemingly no regard for the human element of cities, right? This was something that was foretold in some ways in the Futurama exhibit, which you see photos of here. This was a large model, and you could see people looking at it here at the 1939 New York World's Fair, right? And you can see these horrific visions of a Corbusian sort of towers in the park, urbanism, with these multi-lane roads that are, thank God we didn't build them like this. I mean, look at this one. I don't know if you could see my cursor, but, in the upper right corner here, I can't even count how many lanes there are there, but I mean, this is like, but this really, all this really comes to the fore in the post-war period, and Americans are into this. Not everyone, certainly, not the ones who are negatively affected, as I'll talk about in a moment, but there's a real sense that this is modernity. I mean, this is the future. We should embrace, this is progress, right? Goodbye to the congested, dirty, dense city of the 19th century. It's all light and air and the personal automobile now. And, this woman here looks pretty pleased. This is in Minneapolis about this coming infrastructure, right? So this is embraced by planners all over the United States and, in fact, elsewhere in the world, right? Here's the cover of the March 1960 Seattle telephone directory, and what is on the cover here? It's this vision of the future of progress, of multi-lane expressways running right through the heart of town, right? Imagine this today. I mean, you can't really imagine it today, thank God. Right, and so this, and of course, we all know what the result of this was, right? It was this, right? This is downtown Los Angeles, right? Before the automobile and the construction of the Harbor Freeway, and this is what comes afterward, right? And that is about as shocking and convulsive a transformation as you can imagine. Not only is the freeway punched through this part of town, which was a mostly Latino area, but look at all the building stock that's been scrubbed away for parking, right? And this is a story that goes on in almost every major city in the United States. I want to talk about, to turn back to New York City, I want to talk about one exception to this, and it's an exceptional exception, right? And this was a short section of the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, the section that runs below Brooklyn Heights, along the Brooklyn waterfront, between Brooklyn Heights and what is today Brooklyn Bridge Park, right? And this is and you can see it in a drawing here. It's this really extraordinary triple decked cantilevered structure here, which carries the the northbound lane on one tray, southbound lane on another tray, and at the very top here, you have the provision of open space. This is the Brooklyn Heights Promenade, which looks like this today. And this is really one of the most extraordinary, most wonderful open spaces in New York City, even today, right? And when you're sitting here, you can barely hear any of the traffic down below. Ironically, you can hear it more now, thanks to Michael Van Valkenburg, who is a friend of mine and I am very fond of. He's the landscape architect, Cornell graduate, who designed Brooklyn Bridge Park. He put these berms, as some of you may know, to block the sound of the expressway down in the park along the river, along the harbor. But what they also do is actually deflect some of that noise back up over to the promenade. So, whatever. But when you're sitting up here, you really don't hear much of the parkway below, and you certainly can't see it. It's not the parkway, the expressway, right? This, by the way, was a design that was also conceived by Gilmore Clark and his partner, Michael Rapuano, also a graduate of the College of Architecture and Planning, class of 1927, and at a time when landscape architecture was not over in Cal's, it was actually in the School of Architecture. In any case, Brooklyn Heights was the only section of this otherwise monstrous expressway to get that kind of treatment. Why? Well, then, as now, Brooklyn Heights was a very affluent community, right? This was the patrician Anglo-Dutch community or neighborhood in Brooklyn, very wealthy, very well-connected, very powerful. And they really forced Moses to play nice, right? Actually, to give Moses a little bit more credit, the property owners on Columbia Place up here didn't want this top deck to be a public park. They wanted their backyards, which were sacrificed for the road. They wanted their backyards to extend onto this platform, this terrace. And it was Moses who said, bullshit, we're going to make this a public park. So some credit should be accorded there. But north and south of Brooklyn Heights, the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway was a very different creature, right? This is just south of Brooklyn Heights. This is the BQE under construction going through what is generally known as South Brooklyn. You've got the neighborhoods of Cobble Hill and Clinton Hill on the left here, and you're looking down into parts of Red Hook. And here again, like that image I showed you of, well, I'll show you in a second, of the BQE North up in Williamsburg, it just trenches through the neighborhood, doing enormous damage and forcing the dislocation of hundreds and hundreds of families, right? And dividing forever this community from itself. North of Brooklyn Heights, the road is elevated up for quite a while, and this is what it looks like, right? I don't know which is worse, trenching down below, creating this gash in the fabric, or putting it up on pylons that are not high enough to let daylight in. And so you create, this dark, dirty, rat-filled space underneath that also effectively divides the city from itself, right? And of course, further on in Williamsburg, the road, looks like this. I have photos, which I don't have here, of the clearing of this right-of-way. And it really, it looks like, Sherman's March to the Sea during the Civil War. Very devastating to these communities. And in fact, trigger and expedite a cycle of abandonment, property abandonment, and urban blight that extends right into the 1980s. Now, there's a backlash against this kind of development, and I'm talking about urban expressway construction, not only in New York City, but in cities throughout the United States. San Francisco has a very well-organized anti-expressway movement. In New Orleans, you have the Vieux-Carré Expressway that was going to run along the waterfront, and which was a Robert Moses, sort of a consulting job. That is finally defeated, and in fact leads to the creation of the Vieux-Carré Commission, which is the beginnings of really of historic preservation and landmarking in New Orleans, right? Here you see this this leaflet, this flyer, in opposition to some of the planned expressways that would have bulldozed through some of the African-American parts of Washington, D.C. And all of this is just doesn't come out of thin air. This is part and parcel of this era, the civil rights era, right? Not just the civil rights, the countercultural movement of the 1960s that give us the civil rights movement, the environmental movement, the gay rights movement, the anti-war movement, right? And also the historic preservation movement. And so the anti-highway movement is part and parcel of this, right? Here's a wonderful mural that Linda might remember from Cambridge. This is on the side of a building off, I'm going to forget the name of the road, but Linda, you remember it probably. Along the Charles River, and here you see these people from different walks of life attempting to stop this. And this was the Inner Belt, I-95 Inner Belt project, which would have gutted a huge part of residential part of Cambridge, known as Cambridgeport, and elsewhere. This is the Southwest Expressway as it was envisioned. This was another project that is defeated very famously by a group of community activists who really bring the planners on board and the city officials. This is defeated. This is in Boston, and we get instead the Southwest Corridor Park, which is really a wonderful project that came about in place of the expressway. In fact, a lot of the federal dollars that would have gone to build this from the Interstate Highway Fund went instead to extend the Red Line, the subway line, to Quincy. Now, in New York City, to get back to where I am right now, the last straw in the Moses sort of highway building era was this: the two cross Manhattan roads, and specifically the Lower Manhattan Expressway, right? Which you see running. This is one version of it. There was another version, but the Lower Manhattan Expressway was the last straw, and it's been acronymized or shortened as LOMEX, right? The LOMEX project is the one that famously pits Robert Moses against Jane Jacobs, literally in this case, not in terms of their opposing viewpoints or ideologies. It literally pitches the two against each other. And here you see a drawing of where the Lower Manhattan Expressway would have run. It would have absolutely devastated a huge portion of Lower Manhattan, including what is now the Chelsea. Is it Chelsea or I always forget that. I think it's Chelsea. The Chelsea, the cast iron district, right, which is the largest collection of 19th century cast iron architecture in the world. That would have been gutted, right? And so, but the forces of opposition, the Jacobs camp prevails here, right? Now, it's not very well understood exactly how and why they prevail. It, of course, had a lot to do with Jacobs' advocacy and the good press coverage they were able to get. Because again, there's this backlash now, and Moses's star is sinking fast, right? But really, what really finally ended the Lower Manhattan Expressway was that a road that Moses really wanted to build in Brooklyn was canceled, right, by the state and federal authorities. And that was the Bushwick Expressway, another road that would have cost tens of thousands of people's homes, would have gutted large sections of Crown Heights and portions of East New York, right, or Brownsville, right? This road here, the Bushwick Express, and Bushwick too, right? And this is defeated. And when this is defeated, it suddenly, the Lower Manhattan Expressway didn't make sense anymore. It was just this, like, you know, sort of orphaned little segment of road, because you really needed the Bushwick to take the traffic that Moses wanted the Lower Manhattan Expressway to convey to and from New Jersey and Long Island, right? What happens here is that an alternative project, an alternative expressway is tapped and designated to be built. And it is this one. And here's Lindsay, Mayor Lindsay, who is the mayor at the time of this, what I just described going on. Lindsay was really one of the forces that stopped Robert Moses, especially when he joined forces with Nelson Rockefeller, the governor at the time. And they basically said, no more, right? Enough expressways in New York City. However, they do back the construction of this. And this was going to be the Cross Brooklyn Expressway. I may refer to it as the CBX, right? This, sorry about the, sorry. I live right around the corner from Mount Sinai Morningside. So this was another expressway project that Lindsay, right, and the Planning Commission and even the governor say, yes, build this. This is a good road. Ironically, this was a road that Robert Moses himself wanted to build, but then retracts his support for it because he wants instead all the federal dollars, and I'm talking about federal dollars from the Interstate Highway Program, right, which is basically launched in the mid-1950s during the Eisenhower administration. He wants those federal dollars to be channeled away from this project toward this, right? And again, why? Because he knew that if you built the Bushwick Expressway, it would be carrying so much traffic into Manhattan, right, over the Williamsburg and Bridge and the Queens Midtown, that you would have to build the Lower Manhattan Expressway, right, and perhaps even the Mid-Manhattan Expressway, right? So that's why he said, oh, I'm not interested in this one anymore. I want the Bushwick. Lindsay and Rockefeller and the Planning Commission and other authorities say, no way, we're going to build this one. Why was this a good idea and the other one not? Well, because this road was going to be built in this. Some of you, if you're familiar with Brooklyn, you may know, and especially if you're an infrastructure junkie, you may know about this cut, right? This exists today. This is the Long Island Railroad's Bay Ridge branch right-of-way. Right, it runs, as you see here, from Bay Ridge, Red Hook area, all the way through. No, I'm sorry, from Bay Ridge all the way through to into Queens at the past East New York, right? And it is a trenched rail corridor, very wide in some cases. In some places, this is not one of the wider sections. And even back then in the late 60s, it was barely being used, right? Even today, it's hardly used, right? There's a freight train goes through maybe once every other day or once a week, right? So this made perfect sense. Let's build a road that is in this already existing trench. It's not going to displace anybody or minimal, right? Of course, you need interchanges and things like that. But compared to his other expressway projects, this would have had very, very low impact. Well, this is a road or a corridor, a right-of-way that happens to go between this part of Brooklyn, where there's two or three communities that weren't quite integrated, both physically and racially, and economically. And what I'm talking about here is Canarsie on one hand, right, on one side, the Canarsie neighborhood, which is mostly white, working class white, mostly white ethnic, Jewish and Italian, almost exclusively, but some other groups. And Brownsville and East New York on the other side, right? Which is almost exclusively by now African-American. It was actually a very large Jewish community, right? Especially both of them, Brownsville and East New York. You could see a photo from, and really the core of this neighborhood was along Pitkin Avenue. But white flight sets in, the Jews leave, and African-Americans coming up from the southern states, especially from Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, move in, right? So that by the mid 60s or so, this is mostly an African-American neighborhood, right? And these communities are not, here's a photo from Canarsie, these communities are not exactly loving each other. Let's put it that way. And so this road corridor, which had been a kind of canyon between black and white, between Canarsie and East New York, is envisioned as perhaps an opportunity to bring these communities together, right? And we have there's and especially in the late 60s, this is a place where there is an enormous amount of racial tension and conflict. There was a school teachers strike that emerges in this part of New York City, is specifically Ocean Hill, which is near here, the Ocean Hill School District. What happens in a nutshell is that the African-American community in this part of Brooklyn is basically starting to push back against the curricula, the treatment that their kids are receiving at the hands of the mostly white ethnic teachers, right? And there's basically they want community control over the schools, which happens, right? It's an enormous achievement for the community activists there, but it prompts a terrible period in New York City history when all the teachers go on strike protesting this, right? So this is an embattled part of Brooklyn, an embattled part of New York City. And so what happens here is that this road project, this expressway corridor, or this corridor that is designated to have this modern highway run through it, right? An idea that was a Moses idea originally, is reconfigured into something that might actually not only solve the transportation issue, but heal the city and stitch together these fractured neighborhoods. And this is the beginnings of what was known as linear city, right? Here you see an image of a model of what a portion of this linear city would look like, right? And I'll explain this in more detail in a moment. Linda, I don't know if you can talk to me, but am I doing okay time-wise here?
You're 125. So
Yeah.
if you like another 10 minutes, maybe?
Yeah, perfect. So this is a model of what was proposed, and we're talking about using the air rights over this corridor, over the expressway, to build, to infill, right? As urban designers would refer to today as infill, right? And this is an idea that really was something new. Not so much the idea of a linear city, as I'll show you in a moment, but in New York City, it's a completely new idea to use what used to be, what had been a destructive entity, the urban expressway, as an opportunity now to create something good, right? And Lindsay himself explained or describes it as, and you could see here, a dramatic new concept for community development, right? It is not without precedent, as I said earlier. This was kind of something in the air in the architecture and design and urban planning fields at the time. This idea not only of building in rights of ways using the air rights, but the whole idea of megastructures as a solution to human problems and to the problems of the modern city. Here you see a conjectural project for a portion of Harlem. Actually not, this is Mount Morris Park here. I'm not far from where this portion of Manhattan is. And this was playing off influences from elsewhere in the world, right? You had Archigram experimenting with crazy ideas like the walking city here, these mega structures, self-contained, right? Self-sustaining urban entities. You had on the other side of the Pacific, you had Kenzo Tange and the Japanese metabolists exploring similar ideas. This was Tange's Tokyo Bay project. And then the linear city too has a pedigree and a heritage all its own, right? This was one example of a proposed city along a road corridor, or that included a highway and rail corridor, right? This was Edgar Chambliss's proposed road town from the late 19th century. Soria-Mata had ideas about this for Madrid, a tiny portion of which was actually built, the Ciudad Lineal. And even Le Corbusier, right? Le Corbusier, some of you may be familiar with his Algiers plan, which actually included an enormous amount of residential housing built into an urban expressway. And then even more locally in New York City, this was Paul Rudolph's proposal for the Lower Manhattan Expressway, right? And you see it here, this almost like crystal structure of housing and community infrastructure being built right over the Lomex corridor. And really this is, you know, it's hard to imagine something that would represent the ideas, the values, the visions of Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs brought together. But this really was it, right? You had a highway, a modern road, an expressway to solve, you know, transportation problems as they were prioritized back then. And it was all about motor vehicles, cars, and especially trucks now. But also the community focus, community development focus of Jane Jacobs here too. So both of these come together in a remarkable way. And here you see some cross sections of the linear city, right? And I won't say, and this not only included room for highway, but would have also had a rail corridor running through it. And here's another drawing of it here. This plaza space here is literally built over, it's a roofing over the expressway down below and a rail corridor as well, commuter rail. So you had housing, schools, community centers, daycare, a museum, supermarkets, right? All sorts of communal entities, infrastructure, amenities that would be shared, right? By people on both sides of this once divisive corridor, right? The folks in Canarsie, the largely or predominantly white community, and the predominantly Black community, communities of East New York and Brownsville, right? What happened to it? Well, it didn't get built, as you probably surmised. And it's kind of a long story why it didn't get built, but in a nutshell, if you want to know the full story, I direct you to the requisite or the relevant chapter in my book. I forget what number it was, but it was the fiscal crisis that New York was plunged into beginning in the early 70s that really ended any possibility that this was going to be built, right? The federal government is beginning to withdraw some of the funding, and it doesn't go anywhere. And this, of course, is the famous false, I should say, headline that claimed to have quoted not Henry Ford, President Gerald Ford, saying drop dead to New York City, to New York City's request for a fiscal bailout. And he never really said that, but he might as well have, right? Had this road been built, it would have certainly solved one of the perennial problems, traffic nightmares in New York City, and that is what the BQE today. If any of you have traveled on the BQE in Brooklyn, you know that this is a daily occurrence, right? It's almost an hourly occurrence. The BQE is one of the most horrifically overburdened roads in the United States. Why is that? Well, because trucks, especially coming off the Verrazano Bridge from the rest of the country, from not only Staten Island, New Jersey, but coming in, right, have no choice but to go up the Gowanus Expressway into the BQE if their destination is Queens and all of Long Island, as many of these trucks are designated, right? So they all have to go up that one, thin pipeline to get further east. Had the CBX been built, the Cross Brooklyn Expressway, those trucks, that commercial traffic, right, would have had a second, it would have had an alternative, right? So that's one thing it would have solved, certainly. In addition to being this wonderful opportunity to bring the city together. Now, I said that the linear city died, the Cross Brooklyn Expressway was never built. However, because that corridor, that rail right-of-way is still there, there have been ideas floated to use it for rail, right? For passenger rail, either light rail or heavy rail. And that has been most prominently, most fully proposed, developed by the Regional Plan Association, the RPA, as the Triborough RX project, right? And you can see it here. This is that same exact alignment that I showed, but also going further north using a different rail line that I won't get into right now, right, connecting to that. And so you see this, this is Brooklyn here. It's a little hard to see, Manhattan and Queens here, right? So using this right-of-way, the old Long Island Railroad Bay Ridge Division, would solve a perennial problem of cities that have what transportation planners call a hub and spoke rapid transit system, right? On the left, you see point-to-point different. New York City is one of countless cities in the United States and world that have a hub and spoke system. You can imagine this as Manhattan in the center and the outer boroughs as, these guys. And what that means is if you want to go from, say, the part of Brooklyn where I grew up in Marine Park to, say, Woodside in Queens, you either take an Uber at great expense, or you have to go all the way into the hub to Manhattan and then get another train to go all the way out east again, right? And here's an illustration of that. All the way in, all the way out, right? What the Triborough RX, using that old corridor would do is stitch together these the spokes, right, in the manner that you see here with this red arrow. So it would make it very easy for people to get from parts of Brooklyn to Queens, even up to the South Bronx. This is a little bit disorienting image, but you get the point. So I'm going to stop there. If you have any questions, I would be happy to take them, both from the audience there and from folks online. By the way, if you want to see, learn more about this, my book is available in bookstores or on Amazon. It's called Brooklyn, the Once and Future City. Okay. Is this the screen share is off, I take it, yeah?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay.
Thank you
All right.
so much, Tom. Fascinating.
Questions?
Yeah, questions. Okay, so I'm in the audience, as you can see, with the mic, and we'll also look out for hands. I see Sarah Bronan with her hand raised. Sarah, would you go ahead?
Yeah.
Oh, Sarah, we can't hear you.
Got it. So just to repeat, Tom, that was so great and so fascinating to bring in the political, the spatial, and then the community activism side. Something you just said actually made me curious. You mentioned the Regional Plan Association as being an entity that has influenced some sort of cross-borough transportation issues. I was wondering if you could talk about the role of organizations like that, sort of, planning organizations in this story, as opposed to individuals. And then also, I'd be curious to know what you thought about their most recent proposals about the Gateway project, which, I'm sure is somewhat relevant to this discussion. So that was it.
Organizations like the RPA, and there are many in New York City. I seems new ones every day. What the organizations have, the bench depth and the capacity to really work up these ideas in the form of very compelling proposals, that go beyond what most individuals have the time or skills to do. So they certainly don't replace individual citizen, effort, but they are perhaps more efficient or more effective in bringing these ideas to the public forum in a very compelling in a very compelling way. And the RPA is certainly one of the most well organized. They've been involved with a number of initiatives and efforts to get to improve the city's. And as far as the Gateway project, I'm not that familiar with what with the details of this, but certainly it's got to do with rail infrastructure, which rather desperately needs upgrading. And that is part of this story, because this turn toward automobiles that really began with the seemingly innocuous parkways in Westchester in the 1920s and 30s. What that led to was a nation of motorists and an overemphasis on that one form of transportation to the exclusion of most others, right? And you all know or are familiar with, certainly Sarah, this, that it wasn't just the building of these roads that occurs in that post-war period, but it's the abandonment and outright destruction of what was the greatest, most extensive rail grid in the world, right? And in city after city, small town as well as major cities, we basically walked away from that incredible infrastructure that we had built, right? It actually took less time in 1920 to get by train from New York City to Washington, D.C. than it does today with a steam locomotive. I mean, their average speed was like, 85, 90 miles an hour, where today it's like, 15 miles an hour. And so, upgrading the rail corridor, going through the urban, through the metropolitan areas, certainly, and building a more robust rail infrastructure on the entire Northeast corridor, especially, is desperately needed. The fact that we don't have a high-speed line between, in the Boswash, so-called Boswash corridor is an embarrassment, frankly. It is embarrassing as an American when I talk to people from Europe or China or Japan, that, you know, we don't have, and when we call the Acela high speed, that, you know, that really generates a lot of humor and laughter among a lot of
You had a bit of a giggle over here as well. So
the Acela. They have a nice, the you know, the dining car is nice. I'll say that.
yeah. You've got another question here and then two more in here, but I'm going to pass to Jeff and then I'll bring it over to you.
Hi, Tom. Wonderful talk. I was struck when you were introducing the Bronx River Parkway with the allusion to sort of an extended Central Park. And in fact, you know, as you know, the history of parks, early parks were in response to concerns about public health and then, as you demonstrated, the health of animals in the zoo. Then after the war, were replaced with a concern about economic development, efficiency, et cetera. Then you look at the linear city and the concern is about knitting together communities in a sort of a social amelioration. So these underlying currents that help justify these different projects, what do you think, where do you think these are going? What would the argument be today or in the future around this? And
Sure.
you know.
Well, it would be, I think, and the way we seem to be going, thankfully, is to reverse a lot of the damage that was done, especially in the post-war period with these roads, right? You know, there are a number of cities and, you know, municipal areas that are looking into removing some of this infrastructure from the, you know, the post-war period, especially, and return, you know, and humanizing it, traffic calming it in a sense, right? Syracuse is in the middle of this, right? The Interstate 81 elevated structure, which did enormous damage to Syracuse, right? That is in the process of being replanned. That structure is going to be replaced. As far as I know, the latest decision was to remove that and put it down, put the road down at street level. In a way, not unlike, if those of you familiar with the West Side highway along the west side of Manhattan, right? That used to, I remember that. Jeff, I'm sure you remember the old Miller Highway, which was an elevated road. And it was a nightmare, but it basically cut New York, a huge portion of lower Manhattan and parts of Midtown from the harbor, from the water. And today, you drive down there now and, you know, there's a traffic light every few feet, but it is a humanized infrastructure, arterial now. There's tens of thousands of people use the bikeways along there and various amenities along the shore. So, and there are other cities that are doing this. And that's, I think that's where we're going. We have, you know, the pendulum swung one direction. It's now swung back in a direction that's really emphasizing the human aspect and the urban aspect of this kind of infrastructure.
Thank you. We've got another question here in the hall. There you go.
Yes, thank you very much for your beautiful talk. I'm an alumnus here at Cornell. I want to ask you if your opinion, if you have one, on the congested pricing, the expenses put on for lower driving in lower Manhattan. What would Robert Moses have said to that little scheme?
Well, I think that the various Moseses would have said different things. I think the pre-war Moses probably would have been in favor of it simply because he was such a promoter and builder of parks. And I think, you know, he had a warmer more human quality before World War II. I think the post-war Moses would have been totally against that, you know, because he really saw the automobile as the future, and not just the automobile, but motor, you know, motor vehicles, including trucks and so forth. So I think he would have been very. If you asked if I had an opinion, I have a lot of opinions, but I do think the congestion pricing is a wonderful idea. I mean, it's being batted about as I speak here in the city. I think it's long overdue, and I think it will actually help in many ways, ease the congestion and the traffic in this extremely dense part of the metro area.
Great. Thank you, Tom. We have one
Letitia's got a
question here in the
question.
poll, and then Letitia, I'll come to you next, who's on Zoom. Okay.
Thank you, Professor, for speaking to us today. It was interesting to hear not just about more about the history of highways in New York, but also about this linear city concept in particular. It seems fairly similar to a project in Saudi Arabia right now. But I guess like in answering Professor Chus's question about like highway removal, you talked about like examples like in Rochester where like you have highways that are built above grade that are being torn down. I'm curious, like especially in the Northwest in Seattle and Portland, another solution I've heard bandied about for like the opposite, where highways are kind of like dug under grade, like has been like to lid over the highways. Like in Seattle, they have they lit it over I-5 in an area close to downtown to build a park. In Portland, they've been talking about doing the same in over I-5, like in Northeast Portland, and like I guess and so I guess like it seems like most of the time when people talk about like the lidding concept, they mean more as like a way to like reconnect two parts of the neighborhood that were severed by the highway. But like I'm curious, like how do you think that sort of like compares to like the linear city concept, or like what is the way like lidded that like these lidded spaces could?
Well, that's a great question. It all depends on what you do on top of that lid, right? Another example is the Central Artery in Boston. Right, the Central Artery was, you know, this monstrous road, elevated road that you know, devastated a huge portion of the oldest parts of Boston, and totally cut the north end off from the city, and it was put underground. Right, in the original plan, there was going to be a tremendous amount of infill, in other words, building mass on top of that. On top of the lid, as you put it, right, which would physically have stitched together that gash in the fabric of the city. That didn't happen, and this is what happened instead. Was the community decided that it should all be park, right? And there is such a thing as too much green space, too much park, right? And that's a good example, in my opinion. I mean, I'm not. Others have different views about this, but what happened was by just leaving it open, whether it was lawn or plazas, it kind of replicated the divisive aspects of the highway, but in a greener form, right? It's still this gash that separates the north end from the rest of the city. It's a more pleasant gash, but I think that the solution there, if you really want to stitch the city back together, is to do infill building with parks too, but not all park.
Thank you, Tom. And Letitia, do you want to go ahead on Zoom? Thank you. Oh, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Tom. Being born and raised in Brooklyn, next to the BQE, I've learned a lot. But I wanted to kind of build off of your response to Jeff and this interest of wanting to reverse some of the harm that was done. Yeah. Do you think it has anything, is it racially motivated? I know, at least going back home every single time, there's more and more where there's an increase of white people living in downtown Brooklyn. So do you think because of the gentrification that's taking place in downtown Brooklyn, there's this need or want or interest to redo some of the harm that was done to Black and Brown communities?
Well, first of all, projects like, for example, the High Line, or anytime you invest in infrastructure that will increase the livability, the amenity of a place there, and especially if it's a a place that has been poor or undervalued in the past, you do run the risk of it gentrifying, right? And I think that as far as advocating for this, these projects, these conversions, I think it brings value to everyone, and not just the gentrifying forces. I think it really can pay back or repair some of the damage that was done to specific groups in the past. And it's a well-known fact that these roads were not routed through affluent areas. I mean, the Brooklyn Heights is really an exception here, right? Mostly these roads were run through poor areas, right? And many of those, perhaps a plurality of those poor areas, were places where African Americans or people of color lived. In the case of L.A., it was the Latino community. But and so we see that again and again in cities all over the United States, right? Durham, for example, North Carolina, the Hayti neighborhood, which was often described as the Wall Street of Black North Carolina, was just completely lost to the Durham freeway, right? And were these roads specifically routed through Black communities, right, in an aggressive sort of racist manner? In some cases, there is evidence of that, but I think more commonly it was an economic decision, right? If you have to condemn properties, right, and pay fair market value to the owners, you're going to look for places where the property values are lowest, right? And so it was poor neighborhoods. My mother's neighborhood was lost to the BQE. My mom, Vinegar Hill. My mom grew up right, adjacent to the Brooklyn Navy Yard there. Italian neighborhoods, the Williamsburg, there was a large Hasidic Jewish population that was negatively affected there. The Gowanus Expressway blew out, it's hard to believe today, but blew out what was the largest community of Scandinavians outside of Scandinavia, right? That whole Sunset Park area was Swedish, mostly Swedish, but also Norwegian. And it was just destroyed, by the Gowanus Expressway.
Thank you, Tom. If nobody else has a question, I have, perhaps this is the last question. I would love to hear a little bit of the story of your piecing and the methods and the really thick layers of maps and projects and archives and visuals and architectural historical histories with these broader city histories. Could you give us a little bit of a feel for those of us who don't do this type of work of this project of knowledge production behind the book, but behind also your broader contribution to these debates? I think that it's so rich in what you've shared. It'd be lovely to hear a little bit about maybe even a little bit of your journey in that process.
Well, how many weeks do you have, Sophie?
We have exactly 3.5 minutes.
I love history. I've always been very curious about how we've gotten to the present. What forces were in play, what peoples, what groups, what technologies, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a rich, there's this enormous body of knowledge, mostly hidden knowledge, in our archives, in our libraries, in the built environment itself, right? Buildings are repositories of the past, right? They are layered they signify, right? And to tease that out, to unpack these things, to pull back the layers, to me is really, I mean, it's what I love doing, and it's what drew me to this field. And it also gives us insight as to how we handled problems, how peoples in the past handled problems, right? Problems that frankly we are still struggling with today, right? We certainly have new problems that we've caused and need solving, but you know, there is a timeless dimension to the human project that you know, that bears studying the past and how we have approached you know, problems and challenges in the past.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think there might be a very precise question in the chat for you about the name of an expressway. If you just jump on.
Yeah, I'll look that up.
Super. And yeah, if I can just say on behalf of everybody, thank you so much. I really think it's invaluable to hear in depth the layers of colleagues' work. I think this, you know, obviously you presented a fascinating story, but it also resonates so much with other people in the department's work, and I'm sure with students' interests. Yeah, so thank you so much. And thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I enjoyed dialing in to Milstein.
Let's give Tom a round of applause. Thank you.
Have a good weekend, everybody.
You too. And yeah, enjoy the rest of the Friday. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Tom.